Stand up and show everyone what you really are, Vanessa. Richard's senior partner gestured toward me with his champagne flute at the firm's annual gala, his voice carrying across the ballroom. My husband stood beside him, silent, as 300 lawyers watched. I rose from my seat at the head table, smoothed my gown, and walked toward the exit without a word. Within 72 hours, 40 attorneys had submitted their resignations. The firm's largest clients had terminated their retainers. And Richard's billionaire family was discovering exactly what I'd been doing for the past 8 years, while they dismissed me as decorative and expendable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Peninsula Hotel ballroom glittered with the kind of calculated opulence that Manhattan's legal elite considered understated elegance. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a sculptural arrangement of white orchids that cost more than most people spent on monthly rent. The annual gala for Whitmore and Associates represented the firm's opportunity to display its success to clients, competitors, and the broader legal community. Partners circulated with practiced charm, associates networked with desperate intensity, and spouses performed their expected roles as attractive accessories to professional achievement. I had attended this gala for 8 consecutive years, each one a carefully choreographed performance where I played the part of Richard Whitmore's elegant wife. The role required specific costuming, which tonight consisted of a midnight blue Valentino gown that Richard's mother had selected and had delivered to our penthouse without consulting me about preference or fit. The dress was beautiful in the abstract, sophisticated and appropriate, but it had been chosen for how it would photograph rather than for any consideration of my comfort or personal style. That distinction characterized most aspects of my life as Mrs. Richard Whitmore. The evening had proceeded according to its usual script through cocktails and dinner. I had smiled at the appropriate moments, laughed at jokes that were not funny, and accepted compliments about my appearance with the gracious modesty expected of someone whose only accomplishment was marrying successfully. Richard had introduced me to clients and colleagues with the same practice phrase he had been using for 8 years, describing me as his beautiful wife with an emphasis that made clear beauty was my primary, and perhaps only relevant characteristic. Robert Chun, the firm's managing partner and Richard's mentor, had approached our table during the main course. He was a man in his early 60s who had built Whitmore and Associates into one of Manhattan's most profitable corporate law firms through a combination of legal skill and ruthless client management. His success had made him wealthy and confident in that wealth, assured that his perspective on all matters was correct because it had been validated by financial outcomes. He viewed the world through a lens where value was measured in billable hours and client retention, where anything that did not directly contribute to firm profitability was decorative at best and wasteful at worst. Vanessa, he had said, settling into the empty chair beside me while Richard was networking across the room. You look lovely this evening. That dress is very appropriate. The comment was delivered as compliment, but the emphasis on appropriate suggested assessment rather than admiration, as though I had passed an inspection that I had not realized was occurring. He had continued speaking without waiting for my response, a habit that characterized most of his interactions with people he considered subordinate or insignificant. Richard tells me you have been volunteering at some legal clinic in Brooklyn. His tone suggested that volunteering and Brooklyn were equally dubious choices, activities that respectable people might pursue if they lacked better options, but that were ultimately wastes of time that could be spent on more suitable pursuits. I suppose that keeps you occupied during the day while Richard is working. It is important for spouses to have hobbies. The legal clinic was not a hobby, though I had learned years ago that correcting Robert Chen's mischaracterizations was pointless and potentially counterproductive. The Brooklyn Civil Rights Legal Clinic was a nonprofit organization that provided free legal services to low-income clients facing civil rights violations, housing discrimination, employment disputes, and immigration challenges. I had been volunteering there for 6 years, initially 1 day per week and gradually increasing to 4 full days as my involvement deepened and my capabilities expanded. What had begun as an attempt to fill empty hours while Richard worked 80-hour weeks had transformed into the most meaningful work of my life. I had not attended law school, a fact that Richard's family and colleagues mentioned frequently as evidence of my intellectual limitations. My undergraduate degree was in social work from a state university that none of the Ivy League graduates at Whitmore and Associates had heard of or would respect if they had. When Richard and I had married, I had been working as a case manager at a family services agency, helping clients navigate systems designed to be deliberately complicated and punitive. The work had been exhausting and underpaid, and Richard had encouraged me to leave it after our wedding, suggesting that his income made my salary irrelevant, and that my time would be better spent managing our household and supporting his career. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I had tried to build a life that matched what Richard and his family expected. I had decorated our penthouse with the help of an interior designer his mother recommended. I had attended charity luncheons with the other attorneys' wives, learning to navigate conversations that were simultaneously competitive and superficial, where women compared their husbands' achievements and their own philanthropic activities while pretending the comparisons were collegial rather than adversarial. I had hosted dinner parties where Richard's colleagues discussed legal strategies and firm politics while I ensured their wine glasses remained filled, and their conversations were not interrupted by practical concerns like serving food or clearing plates. The life was comfortable in material terms, filled with the kind of luxury that would have seemed impossible during my childhood in upstate New York, where my parents had worked manufacturing jobs that barely covered rent and groceries. Richard's family wealth was generational and substantial, the kind of money that created cushions against every possible hardship and opened doors that remained closed to people without similar resources. Our penthouse in Tribeca had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. We vacationed in places I had only seen in magazines. I wore clothing that cost more than my mother's monthly salary. By every external measure, I had achieved a life that should have felt like success. But the emptiness of that life had become impossible to ignore by our third anniversary. I was 29 years old, educated and capable, spending my days managing household staff and attending events where my only function was decorative. Richard worked constantly, leaving for the office before I woke and returning after I had eaten dinner alone. On weekends, he played golf with clients or reviewed documents in his home office. Our conversations, when they occurred, focused on his work, his stress, his partnership track, his billable hours. When I attempted to discuss my own interests or concerns, he listened with the patronizing attention someone might give a child describing their day at school. The Brooklyn Civil Rights Legal Clinic had entered my life through a connection I had maintained from my social work days. Elena Rodriguez, a former colleague who had gone to law school at night while working full-time, had founded the clinic with 2 other attorneys who shared her commitment to using legal skills for public benefit rather than private profit. She had called me during my 3rd year of marriage, knowing I had capacity and skills that were being wasted on managing a household that required minimal actual management. We need someone who understands how to work with clients from difficult circumstances, Elena had explained. Someone who can do intake, help with case management, coordinate with social services. You were always the best at building trust with clients who had every reason not to trust systems or institutions. The work does not pay anything, but it matters more than most of what happens in those corporate firms your husband works at. I had started volunteering 1 day per week, telling Richard it was charity work that his mother would approve of, framing it in terms that made it sound like the kind of acceptable philanthropic activity that wives of successful attorneys were expected to perform. He had barely registered the information, nodding absently while reviewing a brief on his laptop. As long as the volunteer work did not interfere with my availability for firm events or dinner parties, he had no objection to how I spent my time. That 1 day per week had revealed something I had been missing since leaving my case management job. Purpose. The clients who came to the clinic were facing genuine crises, evictions and wage theft and discrimination that threatened their ability to survive in a city that was increasingly hostile to anyone without significant resources. They needed help navigating legal systems that were designed to favor landlords and employers and institutions, systems that assumed anyone without an attorney was either incompetent or undeserving of protection. The work was difficult and often frustrating, but it was real in ways that nothing else in my life felt real. Elena had recognized my engagement immediately. "You are good at this," she had said after my first month of volunteering. "You understand how to translate between what clients need and what the legal system requires. That is a rare skill. Most lawyers are good at law but terrible at understanding the human beings they are supposed to be serving." She had paused, then asked a question that would change the trajectory of my life. Have you ever thought about going to law school? I had thought about law school before meeting Richard, but the cost and time commitment had seemed impossible while working full-time at a job that barely covered living expenses. After marrying Richard, law school had seemed unnecessary and potentially threatening to the role I was expected to perform. Attorneys' wives were not supposed to compete with their husbands professionally or pursue careers that might be more meaningful than supporting their husband's success. But Elena's question had opened a possibility I had closed off, suggesting that perhaps the life I was living was not the only life available to me. I had applied to law schools that offered evening programs, institutions that would allow me to continue my volunteer work during the day while taking classes at night. I had taken the LSAT without telling Richard, studying in the hours while he was at the office, preparing with the same intensity one had once brought to my social work graduate program. My score had been high enough to earn admission to several programs, and I had enrolled at Brooklyn Law School without fully considering how Richard would respond to this decision. His reaction had been worse than I had anticipated, but also somehow exactly what I should have expected. Law school, Vanessa? His tone had suggested I had announced plans to join a circus rather than pursue a professional degree. Why would you do that? You do not need to work. I make more than enough money for both of us. The implicit message was clear. My pursuing legal education suggested that his income was insufficient or that I was dissatisfied with the life he had provided, both of which reflected poorly on him rather than representing my own legitimate ambitions. I had tried to explain that law school was not about financial necessity, but about personal growth and professional development, about wanting to contribute more meaningfully than managing a household and attending galas. Richard had listened with visible impatience, then delivered his assessment with the confidence of someone who believed his perspective was simply factual rather than opinion. You are not going to be a lawyer, Vanessa. You are 30 years old. By the time you finish law school and pass the bar, you will be 33. That is too old to start a legal career, especially without connections or experience. You will waste 3 years and accomplish nothing except making yourself unavailable for the responsibilities you actually have as my wife. I had enrolled anyway, a decision that had created the first genuine conflict in our marriage. Richard had opposed my attendance at every stage, complaining about my reduced availability for his social obligations, expressing skepticism about my ability to handle the academic rigor, and predicting that I would eventually quit once I realized how difficult law school actually was. His opposition had been constant but passive, expressed through comments and implications rather than direct prohibition. He could not actually prevent me from attending law school, but he could make clear that he viewed my choice as selfish and foolish. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Law school had been brutal in ways I had not fully anticipated. The evening program meant attending classes from 6 until 10 at night, 4 nights per week, after spending full days at the legal clinic. The workload was overwhelming, hundreds of pages of reading each week, complex legal concepts that required multiple readings to understand, Socratic method instruction that turned every class into an intellectual combat zone where professors targeted students with questions designed to expose gaps in understanding. I studied during lunch breaks on subway rides, in the hours after Richard left for work and before I needed to leave for class. Richard's prediction that I would quit had nearly come true during my first semester, when the combination of coursework and volunteer work and managing his expectations had pushed me to a breaking point where continuing seemed impossible. But Elena had talked me through that crisis, reminding me why I had started, helping me develop better time management systems, and connecting me with other evening students who understood the particular challenges of pursuing legal education while maintaining other life responsibilities. I had finished law school in 3.5 years, a semester longer than the traditional program because I had needed to reduce my course load during one particularly overwhelming period. I had passed the bar exam on my first attempt, a success that Richard had acknowledged with a card and dinner at an expensive restaurant, treating my accomplishment like a hobby that had reached its natural conclusion rather than the beginning of an actual legal career. He had assumed that passing the bar would end my involvement with the legal clinic, that I would return to the appropriate role of supporting his career now that I had proven whatever I had needed to prove to myself. Instead, I had asked Elena if the clinic needed another attorney. We had spent 6 years working together at that point, and she knew my capabilities and commitment. The clinic could not pay market rates, she had explained, but they could offer a modest salary that would at least acknowledge that my work was professional rather than voluntary. I had accepted immediately, finally transforming my volunteer position into an actual career, becoming a practicing attorney focused on civil rights and social justice work. Richard's response to my becoming a paid employee at the clinic had been dismissive rather than opposed. The salary Elena offered was a tiny fraction of what first-year associates at Whitmore and Associates earned, barely enough to cover my student loans and personal expenses. In Richard's assessment, my legal career was a hobby that happened to generate a small amount of income, fundamentally different from real legal work that served corporate clients and generated substantial profits. He introduced me at firm events as an attorney, but always with qualifications that made clear my work was charitable rather than serious, pro bono rather than commercial, well-intentioned rather than professionally significant. His family had been even more dismissive. Richard's mother, Patricia Whitmore, had built her identity around her husband's success as a federal judge and her son's achievements at the family law firm that her father had founded. She viewed my legal career as an eccentricity that reflected poorly on Richard's ability to provide adequately for his wife, suggesting that respectable women married to successful men focused on philanthropy and family, rather than pursuing independent careers. At family dinners, she asked about my little legal projects with the same patronizing tone someone might use to inquire about a child's school art assignments. Robert Chen's comment at the gala about my volunteer work being a hobby was entirely consistent with how Richard's family and colleagues had been characterizing my career for the past 3 years. They could acknowledge that I had a law degree and bar admission without accepting that I was an actual attorney doing meaningful legal work. In their framework, real legal work happened at firms like Whitmore and Associates, serving wealthy clients and generating significant fees. What I did was charity, admirable perhaps in abstract terms but ultimately insignificant compared to the serious business of corporate law. I had smiled politely at Robert's comment about hobbies, giving the expected response that confirmed his assumptions rather than challenged them. The gala was not the appropriate venue for explaining the complexity of the cases I handled or the impact of the work the clinic performed. Robert Chen was not genuinely curious about my career. His comment was performative, a gesture toward acknowledging my existence before returning his attention to matters he actually cared about. He had continued speaking, transitioning to the actual purpose of his visit to our table. I wanted to mention that the firm has been very pleased with Richard's work this year. His billing numbers are exceptional, and his client development has exceeded our expectations for someone at his level. Robert had glanced toward where Richard was standing across the room, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a mentor watching a protégé succeed according to plan. We will be making partnership decisions in the next few months, and I wanted you to know that Richard is being seriously considered. The partnership announcement was significant for Richard's career, but also for our marriage in ways that Robert Chen did not fully understand. Partnership at Whitmore and Associates came with substantial financial benefits, a significant equity stake in the firm, and most importantly, the security and status that Richard had been pursuing since joining the firm 9 years earlier. It also came with expectations about partners' spouses, unwritten but clearly communicated rules about the kind of support and participation that partners' wives were expected to provide. Patricia Whitmore had already begun coaching me on these expectations, explaining that partnership would require me to be more available for firm events, more active in the social aspects of client relationship management, more focused on supporting Richard's career rather than pursuing my own interests. The implication was clear. My work at the legal clinic would need to become genuinely voluntary again, reduced to 1 or 2 days per week at most, leaving more time for the responsibilities that came with being a partner's wife. My own legal career, modest as it was, would need to be sacrificed to Richard's more important professional advancement. I had not agreed to these expectations, but I had not explicitly refused them either. The partnership decision was months away, and I had been postponing the conversation about what Richard's advancement would mean for my own work. Part of me hoped that once he achieved partnership, once the external pressure and constant evaluation ended, he might become more supportive of my career or at least more present in our actual marriage. But a larger part of me recognized that partnership would only intensify the dynamics that had been building throughout our marriage, the expectation that my life should organize itself entirely around his success. Robert had stood to leave, placing his hand briefly on my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be avuncular but felt patronizing. "I am glad Richard found someone who understands her role," he had said. "Not every attorney's wife is willing to put their husband's career first. That is what makes the difference between adequate lawyers and true partners." He had walked away before I could respond, returning to circulation among the tables where more important people required his attention. The comment had been intended as a compliment, but it had landed like an assessment of my value that was contingent on my willingness to remain subordinate. I understood my role. I put Richard's career first. These were the behaviors that earned approval in Robert Chen's framework, the characteristics that made me an asset to Richard's partnership prospects, rather than a liability. My own law degree and legal career were irrelevant to this assessment. What mattered was my willingness to perform the expected role without complaint or visible ambition that might complicate Richard's advancement. The dinner plates had been cleared and dessert had been served when Robert Chen had returned to the podium for the final remarks of the evening. This portion of the gala served multiple functions, acknowledging significant firm achievements, thanking major clients for their continued business, and reinforcing the culture and values that Whitmore and Associates claimed to represent. Robert spoke with the polished ease of someone who had delivered hundreds of similar speeches, his remarks balancing humor and gravitas in ways that played well to an audience of people who shared his professional background and values. He had been building toward his conclusion, offering generic inspirational comments about excellence and dedication, and the firm's bright future, when he had abruptly shifted direction in a way that felt both spontaneous and calculated. "Before I close, I want to acknowledge something that has been on my mind this evening." His tone had changed, becoming more conversational, as though he were sharing a personal observation rather than delivering prepared remarks. "We have many talented attorneys at this firm, people who have dedicated themselves to excellence in legal practice and client service." He had paused, scanning the room with what appeared to be spontaneous recognition but was likely carefully planned theatrical timing. "But we also have people at this firm who are here because of who they married rather than what they contribute." His comment had landed in sudden silence, the hundreds of conversations at the tables stopping as people processed what had just been said. Spouses who treat their connection to this firm as an opportunity for personal advancement, rather than as a responsibility to support the people doing actual legal work. The comment was ostensibly general, applicable to any spouse whose connection to the firm came through marriage rather than legal work. But Robert's gaze had moved to our table as he spoke, making the target of his remarks unmistakably clear. "I want everyone here to understand something fundamental. This firm succeeds because our attorneys are willing to prioritize their work above personal interests, and because their spouses are willing to support that dedication without demanding attention or creating complications." He had gestured toward me with his champagne flute, the movement drawing every eye in the ballroom to where I sat at the head table. "Stand up and show everyone what you really are, Vanessa. Let people see the kind of support that makes partnership possible." The request was framed as invitation but delivered with enough edge to make clear that refusing was not truly an option. I had felt the weight of 300 people's attention, all of them waiting to see how I would respond to what was ostensibly recognition but felt like public evaluation. Richard sat beside me, his expression carefully neutral, neither objecting to Robert's comments nor offering any gesture of support or protection. His silence in that moment communicated everything about our marriage more clearly than 8 years of accumulated small compromises and unspoken resentments. He would not defend me against public humiliation from his mentor, because protecting me would risk his partnership prospects. The realization crystallized with sudden, absolute clarity. I was not Richard's partner in any meaningful sense. I was an asset he had acquired, useful for the social and domestic support I provided, valuable primarily for my willingness to subordinate my own ambitions to his career advancement. Everything I had achieved, my law degree and bar admission and legal career, was irrelevant to how he and his colleagues perceived me. I would always be Richard's wife first and perhaps only, my own identity and accomplishments rendered invisible by the more important fact of who I had married. I had stood slowly, smoothing my Valentino gown with deliberate care, taking time to collect my small evening bag from the table. The ballroom had gone completely silent, everyone watching to see what I would do or say, whether I would perform the expected role of gracious supportive spouse, or whether I would create a scene that would become firm gossip for months afterward. Robert Chun stood at the podium with his champagne flute raised, his expression carrying satisfaction at having created this moment of public affirmation of firm values and hierarchy. I had walked toward the exit without speaking, my heels clicking against the marble floor in the profound silence that had filled the ballroom. I did not look back at Richard, did not acknowledge Robert Chen's raised glass, did not provide the performance of supportive spouse that everyone was waiting to witness. I simply left, walking out of the Peninsula Hotel into the November night, leaving behind the gala and the firm and the role I had been performing for 8 years. Standing on Fifth Avenue while the valet retrieved a taxi, I had felt something shift fundamentally in my understanding of my own life. The marriage I had been trying to preserve was already over, had perhaps been over for years, sustained only by my willingness to accept being diminished in exchange for material comfort and social status. Richard's silence during Robert's public humiliation had been a choice, a decision that his career mattered more than my dignity, that partnership at Whitmore and Associates was worth any cost including his wife's public degradation. The choice I was making by leaving the gala was different. It was not impulsive or emotional, though emotion was certainly present. It was clear-eyed recognition that continuing to perform a role that required accepting humiliation and subordination was unsustainable. I could not continue being Mrs. Richard Whitmore under the terms that his family and firm expected. Something fundamental would need to change, and that change would need to begin with me refusing to accept treatment that reduced me to decorative insignificance. I had not yet decided what specific actions that refusal would require, what form that change would take, what consequences would follow from choosing my dignity over my marriage. But sitting in the taxi heading back to our Tribeca penthouse, I knew with absolute certainty that I would not return to the Peninsula Hotel ballroom, would not apologize for leaving, would not resume the performance of grateful subordination that everyone expected. Whatever came next would be on terms I defined rather than roles others assigned. The next 72 hours would reveal exactly what those terms would be, and what capabilities I had been developing during 8 years of marriage while Richard and his family and colleagues had dismissed me as decorative and expendable. They had made the mistake of assuming that someone who chose not to compete visibly was incapable of competition. They had confused my choice to focus on meaningful work, rather than status and money with inability to operate in their world of corporate law and strategic maneuvering. They were about to discover that their assessment had been comprehensively wrong. The taxi driver had navigated through midtown traffic with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades learning the city's rhythms and shortcuts. I sat in the back seat watching Manhattan pass through the window, the familiar streets and buildings suddenly appearing foreign, as though I were seeing the city for the first time or perhaps seeing it clearly after years of distortion. The evening air was cold enough that my breath would have been visible if I had been standing outside, but inside the heated taxi I felt oddly disconnected from physical sensation, my mind processing what had just occurred at the gala with a clarity that felt almost clinical. Robert Chen's public humiliation had not been spontaneous despite his delivery suggesting otherwise. The comment had been calculated, designed to reinforce firm hierarchy and values in front of clients and colleagues, using me as an object lesson in appropriate spousal behavior. What made the moment particularly revealing was not Robert's willingness to humiliate me publicly, though that was significant, but Richard's absolute silence during and after the incident. His refusal to object or defend or even acknowledge that something inappropriate had occurred communicated his priorities more clearly than years of accumulated smaller moments had done. The penthouse was dark when I arrived home, all 2,300 square feet of luxury accommodation empty except for the ambient sounds of expensive appliances maintaining their programmed functions. Richard would remain at the gala for hours yet, networking and celebrating and performing the role of rising partner, who had successfully demonstrated his commitment to firm values by allowing his wife to be publicly diminished without objection. He would return late, probably after midnight, and would expect to find me either asleep or pretending to be asleep, the evening's events processed and absorbed and accepted as simply the cost of being married to an ambitious corporate attorney. I had no intention of sleeping or pretending or absorbing this particular humiliation. Instead, I made coffee using the Italian espresso machine that Richard's mother had given us as a wedding gift, a device so complicated that it had required professional installation and quarterly maintenance visits. The coffee was excellent, rich and strong, appropriate fuel for what was going to be a long night of clear-eyed assessment and strategic planning. I had learned over 6 years at the legal clinic that the most effective advocacy came from thorough preparation and comprehensive understanding of all available options and leverage points. Tonight required that same methodical approach applied to my own circumstances. I changed out of the Valentino gown into comfortable clothing, jeans and a sweater that I had purchased myself rather than items selected by Richard's mother or stylists who understood what Mrs. Richard Whitmore should wear. The simple act of wearing clothes chosen for comfort rather than appearance felt like a small reclamation of autonomy, a reminder that I existed as a person beyond the role I had been performing. I settled at the dining table with my laptop and a legal pad, ready to conduct the kind of thorough case analysis that I performed regularly for clinic clients but had never applied to my own life. The first question requiring clear assessment was what exactly I wanted from whatever came next. The easy answer was that I wanted to leave the marriage, to extract myself from a relationship that required accepting diminishment and subordination in exchange for material comfort and social status. But the more complex question was what leaving actually meant in practical terms, what resources I would need, what obstacles I would face, what strategic advantages I possessed that were not immediately obvious to Richard or his family or the firm that employed him. My legal training had taught me to begin with thorough fact-gathering before moving to analysis or strategy. I opened a new document on my laptop and began cataloging everything relevant to my situation, creating a comprehensive record that would serve as foundation for whatever decisions followed. The exercise was familiar from my work at the clinic, where clients facing eviction or employment discrimination or immigration proceedings needed to understand their complete circumstances before we could develop effective advocacy strategies. The marriage itself was relatively straightforward in legal terms. Richard and I had signed a prenuptial agreement drafted by attorneys his father had recommended, a document that was comprehensive and heavily weighted in favor of protecting Whitmore family assets. I had my own attorney review it before signing, a sole practitioner who had charged reasonable rates and provided competent advice given the constraints we were working within. The prenup specified that I would receive minimal support in the event of divorce, essentially enough to cover basic living expenses for 2 years, while I established independent income. Any claim to Richard's partnership equity or family wealth was explicitly foreclosed. At the time I signed the prenup, the terms had seemed reasonable if not generous. I had been 24 years old, employed as a case manager making $38,000 annually, marrying into a family whose wealth was genuinely difficult to comprehend from my working-class background. The idea that I might have any claim to Whitmore family money had seemed presumptuous, and Richard had framed the prenup as protecting both of us from future complications rather than as protection against me specifically. I had signed it willingly, even gratefully, focused on love and future possibilities rather than strategic positioning for potential divorce. 8 years later, the prenup's terms looked different. I had a law degree that I had financed myself through student loans. I had a legal career that I had built independently of any support or assistance from Richard or his family. I had professional relationships and skills and credentials that were entirely my own achievements. The prenup treated me as though I were the same person I had been at 24, someone whose only assets were what marriage provided, rather than recognizing everything I had developed during the marriage itself. But the prenup was legal and valid, and would govern the financial aspects of any divorce regardless of what I thought about its fairness. Challenging it would be expensive and likely unsuccessful, given how carefully it had been drafted and how clearly I had been represented by independent counsel when signing it. The strategic question was not whether I could overcome the prenup but whether I needed to, whether I possessed leverage or resources that the prenup's drafters had not anticipated or accounted for. I moved to the second major category requiring assessment, which was my own financial position independent of Richard and the marriage. This required logging into bank accounts and reviewing statements, examining the structure of our finances with attention to what was actually mine versus what was joint or his. The exercise revealed something I already knew but had not fully processed. Nearly everything we owned was in Richard's name or structured to protect his interests. The penthouse was owned by a family trust. The cars were leased through his law firm. The investment accounts were his separate property per the prenup. Our joint checking account held minimal funds, essentially operating expenses for household management. My own assets were modest but entirely unencumbered. I had a checking account with approximately $8,000, Money I had accumulated from my salary at the clinic after paying my student loans and covering personal expenses that Richard viewed as discretionary and therefore my responsibility to fund. I had a retirement account from my previous social work position with about $12,000 left untouched during my marriage. I had my law degree and bar admission, credentials that could not be taken away or devalued regardless of what happened to the marriage. I had 6 years of professional experience at a highly respected civil rights clinic, relationships with other attorneys and advocates throughout the city, and a reputation for competence and dedication that I had earned through actual work, rather than family connections. The disparity between Richard's resources and mine was vast in purely financial terms. He had access to millions of dollars through family wealth and partnership equity. I had $20,000 in liquid assets and a salary that barely covered living expenses in New York City. In a conventional analysis, he held all the advantages in any potential divorce proceeding. But conventional analysis assumed that money was the only form of leverage worth considering. And my years at the legal clinic had taught me that many forms of power exist beyond simple financial resources. I began a new section of my notes focused on what I knew about Whitmore and Associates that Richard and his family assumed I did not understand or care about. Living with Richard for 8 years while he discussed work constantly had provided an education in the firm's operations, client relationships, internal politics, and strategic vulnerabilities. He had talked about cases and clients and firm dynamics with the assumption that I was not really listening or would not understand the significance of what he was revealing. That assumption had been comprehensively wrong. I knew which clients generated the majority of the firm's revenue, and how dependent the firm was on maintaining those relationships. I knew which partners were in conflict with each other over compensation and case distribution. I knew which associates were unhappy with their treatment, and which senior attorneys were considering leaving for competitor firms or starting their own practices. I knew about the case that had been settled quietly last year after a partner made inappropriate comments to a female associate, and I knew about the client who had been billed for work that was never actually performed, and I knew about the systematic undervaluing of work performed by women and minority attorneys compared to work performed by white male attorneys like Richard. This knowledge existed in my memory as accumulated observations and overheard conversations, fragments that I had not organized into coherent analysis because I had not needed to use it strategically. But tonight, cataloging what I knew with the same attention I brought to building cases for clinic clients, I recognized that I possessed significant information about firm operations and vulnerabilities that could become leverage if deployed appropriately. The question was whether deploying that leverage served my interests and aligned with my values, or whether doing so would make me complicit in the same kind of strategic manipulation that characterized how the firm operated. The third major category requiring assessment was my professional network and relationships outside the marriage. This inventory was more encouraging than the financial analysis had been. Over 6 years at the Brooklyn Civil Rights Legal Clinic, I had developed working relationships with dozens of attorneys practicing in various specialties throughout New York. I knew legal aid lawyers and public defenders and civil rights advocates and immigration attorneys and small firm practitioners who handled consumer protection and employment discrimination cases. These were not corporate lawyers who generated massive fees, but they were skilled advocates who understood how legal systems actually functioned and who valued the kind of work I had been doing. Elena Rodriguez was the most important relationship in this network, my mentor and supervisor, and the person who had convinced me to attend law school in the first place. We had worked together for 6 years developing a relationship built on genuine respect and shared commitment to using legal skills for public benefit. Elena had founded the clinic after spending a decade at a large firm, leaving once she accumulated enough savings to take the financial risk of nonprofit work. She understood corporate legal culture from direct experience, knew its values and incentives and vulnerabilities, and had chosen to build something different that prioritized impact over profit. I had called Elena from the taxi leaving the Peninsula Hotel, a brief conversation where I explained what had happened at the gala and asked if we could meet the following morning. Her response had been immediate and unambiguous. She told me I could come to her apartment tonight if I needed someone to talk to, but agreed that morning would allow for more thoughtful conversation. Her final comment before ending the call had been characteristically direct. She had said that she was proud of me for walking out, that staying would have required accepting something unacceptable, and that we would figure out together what came next. That affirmation from someone whose judgment I trusted had been steadying, Confirmation that my instinct to leave the gala rather than perform the expected role had been correct. Beyond Elena, I knew at least 40 other attorneys well enough to ask for advice or assistance, people I had worked with on joint cases or coordinated with on client referrals or collaborated with on policy advocacy. These relationships were professional rather than personal in most cases, but they were genuine and based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. Several of these attorneys worked at firms that might be interested in hiring someone with my background and skills, though none of them could offer the kind of salary that would match what associates at Whitmore and Associates earned. But salary was not the only relevant consideration when evaluating employment options. I had also developed relationships with former clients, people I had represented successfully who had moved on to stable employment and housing, and who remembered the assistance the clinic had provided during their crises. These relationships were less formally professional but equally valuable in their own way. Connections to people across various industries and circumstances who understood what it meant to be helped during difficult circumstances, and who might be willing to reciprocate if given the opportunity. I made notes about specific individuals who might be resources for whatever transition I was planning, building a comprehensive map of available support and connection. The fourth category requiring assessment was what I knew about Richard specifically that he assumed I did not know or would never use against him. This was the most ethically complicated category because it involved information obtained through the intimacy and trust of marriage, knowledge that using strategically could be characterized as betrayal. But Robert Chen's public humiliation and Richard's silent complicity had released me from any remaining obligation to protect Richard's interests at the expense of my own dignity and well-being. I knew that Richard had been having an affair with an associate at the firm for approximately 8 months. I had discovered this not through dramatic confrontation or private investigator surveillance, but through the mundane evidence that accumulates when someone is being careless about covering their tracks. Late-night text messages with obviously false explanations. Charges on credit card statements for restaurants and hotels in contexts that did not match Richard's claimed schedule. The particular quality of guilt-driven overcompensation that appeared in his behavior after weekends when he claimed to be working but was clearly doing something else. I had not confronted Richard about the affair because doing so would have forced a marital crisis that I had not been prepared to navigate while still finishing law school and establishing my legal career. The strategic choice had been to file the knowledge away for potential future use, while focusing on building my own professional independence. That calculation had been coldly practical rather than emotional, recognition that confronting Richard about infidelity, while I was still financially and professionally dependent on the marriage, was poor strategy that would likely result in my being blamed for creating problems rather than his being held accountable for betrayal. Now the affair was simply information that might or might not be useful depending on how divorce proceedings unfolded. If Richard chose to cooperate with a straightforward dissolution of the marriage, I had no interest in public revelation or personal revenge. But if he decided to make the divorce difficult or contested the modest support specified in the prenup, then his affair with a subordinate associate at his own firm became leverage that could motivate more cooperative behavior. The information was insurance against unreasonable opposition, a check on his ability to make my life more difficult than necessary during separation. I also knew details about several of Richard's cases that involved ethical borderline behavior, if not outright violations. Nothing that rose to the level of reporting obligations under professional responsibility rules, but practices that clients might find concerning if they understood how their matters were being handled. Excessive billing for work that could have been done more efficiently. Strategic delays that benefited the firm's billable hours, rather than client interests. The recycling of research and writing from previous cases, while billing as though everything was created fresh for each new client. These were common practices at large firms, normalized through repetition and rationalization, but they were also practices that could create problems if scrutinized by clients or disciplinary authorities. Again, this knowledge was insurance rather than a weapon I had any interest in deploying unless Richard made it necessary. I had no desire to damage his legal career or cause him professional harm. But I also had no interest in being cooperative and accommodating while he and his firm and his family treated me as expendable and insignificant. If protecting myself required making clear that I possessed knowledge that could create problems for him, then I was prepared to make that calculation and take that action. The fifth and final category requiring thorough assessment was what I wanted to accomplish beyond simply extracting myself from the marriage. Leaving Richard was necessary for my dignity and well-being, but it was not sufficient as a complete plan for what came next. I needed to think strategically about how to position myself professionally and financially and personally for whatever life followed divorce. This required honest assessment of my strengths and limitations, realistic understanding of available opportunities, and clear vision of what success would actually look like beyond the simple fact of being unmarried. My legal career at the clinic was meaningful and fulfilling in ways that no corporate practice could match, but the salary was not sufficient for long-term financial stability in New York City. I was earning $45,000 annually, barely enough to cover rent in a modest apartment and student loan payments and basic living expenses. Without Richard's income supporting me, I would need to either increase my earnings significantly or reduce my expenses dramatically, or both. The prenup's temporary support would help during the transition period, but 2 years of modest assistance would not solve the fundamental problem of building sustainable income. I had several options for increasing earning potential. I could look for positions at larger nonprofit organizations that paid more than small clinics like Elena's. I could consider government positions as a prosecutor or public defender or attorney with a regulatory agency, roles that offered better compensation than nonprofit work, while still focusing on public interest rather than corporate profit. I could even explore small firm practice or solo practice focusing on the kind of civil rights and employment work I had been doing at the clinic, building a practice that could generate higher income while maintaining alignment with my values. Each option had advantages and disadvantages requiring careful evaluation. Larger nonprofits often had more bureaucracy and less flexibility than small organizations like the clinic. Government positions offered stability and benefits, but could involve political constraints and institutional limitations. Small firm or solo practice provided autonomy and unlimited income potential, but required business development skills and comfort with financial risk that I had not yet developed. The decision about professional direction would need to wait until the immediate crisis of leaving the marriage was resolved, but thinking through options now would make later choices more strategic and less reactive. Beyond career questions, I needed to consider where I wanted to live and what kind of life I wanted to build independent of Richard and his family. The Tribeca penthouse had never felt like home despite 8 years of residence, always remaining Richard's space that I inhabited, rather than our shared environment. When I imagined leaving, I felt no attachment to the apartment or the neighborhood or the lifestyle it represented. What I wanted was something smaller and more manageable, probably in Brooklyn near the clinic, a space that belonged to me and reflected my actual preferences rather than conforming to someone else's standards of appropriate accommodation. I also wanted to rebuild relationships with my own family that had attenuated during my marriage. My parents in upstate New York had never been comfortable with Richard or his family, finding the wealth and social pretension alienating, and the whole Manhattan corporate law world incomprehensible and vaguely suspicious. I had visited them less frequently as the marriage continued, partly because Richard never wanted to accompany me, and partly because the contrast between their lives and mine had become so stark that bridging it required exhausting emotional labor. Divorce would create space to reconnect with them on more authentic terms, to rebuild the relationship without the barrier of a marriage that had never made sense to them. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I finished my comprehensive assessment, pages of notes capturing my complete situation from multiple analytical perspectives. The exercise had taken hours but provided exactly what I needed, which was clear understanding of my position and available options and strategic leverage. I was not powerless despite the vast disparity in financial resources between Richard and myself. I possessed knowledge and relationships and professional skills that created possibilities beyond what the prenup's drafters had contemplated. The immediate practical question was where I would stay tonight, and for however long it took to organize a more permanent separation. Remaining in the penthouse until Richard returned from the gala felt unacceptable, sitting there waiting to perform the role of chastened wife who had learned her lesson about public obedience. But I also did not want to leave precipitously in a way that could be characterized as abandonment of the marital home, creating potential complications in eventual divorce proceedings. I compromised by packing a suitcase with clothing and essential items, enough to last several weeks without needing to return for additional belongings. I left a brief note on the kitchen counter explaining that I was staying with a friend for a few days and needed space to think about what had occurred at the gala. The note was deliberately vague about my location and intentions, neither aggressive nor apologetic, simply stating facts without elaboration. Richard would read it when he returned from the gala, and would need to decide whether to reach out to me or wait for me to contact him. I called Elena from the taxi heading toward her apartment in Fort Greene, apologizing for the late hour but explaining that I needed a place to stay tonight. Her response had been immediate and warm. She told me her guest room was available for as long as I needed it, that I should come directly to her building, and that we could talk in the morning after I had slept and processed everything that had happened. The simple kindness of that response, the absence of judgment or interrogation, the unconditional offer of support, made me realize how starved I had been for genuine friendship rather than performative social relationships. Elena's apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a brownstone that had been converted to rental units, comfortable and cluttered in ways that reflected actual living, rather than design presentation. She met me at the door in a bathrobe, her expression carrying concern but not pity, ready to listen if I wanted to talk or simply show me to the guest room if I preferred to sleep. I had chosen sleep, recognizing that I was beyond coherent conversation, and needed rest before attempting to make any additional decisions. The guest room was small and simply furnished, nothing like the luxury accommodation I was accustomed to in the Tribeca penthouse. The bed was comfortable but not expensive, the sheets were clean but not designer, the whole space was functional rather than impressive. And yet lying there in the darkness, listening to the ordinary sounds of Brooklyn at night, rather than the artificial silence of luxury high-rise living, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Relief. The relief of being in a space where I did not need to perform or maintain appearance or meet anyone's expectations about who I was supposed to be. I had walked out of the Peninsula Hotel ballroom 7 hours earlier with no clear plan beyond refusing to accept further humiliation. Now, lying in Elena's guest room with a comprehensive assessment of my situation completed and a suitcase of belongings suggesting at least temporary separation, I recognized that I had done something more significant than simply leaving a party early. I had begun the process of reclaiming agency over my own life, refusing to continue accepting treatment that required surrendering dignity in exchange for material comfort. The next morning would bring difficult conversations and strategic decisions about how to proceed with formal separation and eventual divorce. Richard would undoubtedly contact me, probably angry about my disappearance but possibly willing to discuss terms for ending the marriage without unnecessary conflict. His family would certainly become involved, Patricia Whitmore in particular never missing an opportunity to manage situations that might reflect poorly on family reputation. The firm would have opinions about how the situation should be handled to minimize any potential impact on Richard's partnership prospects. But none of those future complications mattered tonight. What mattered was that I had taken the first concrete action toward building a different life, one where my legal career and professional identity were not subordinated to someone else's advancement, where public humiliation from a senior partner did not go unchallenged, where I defined success according to my own values rather than accepting definitions imposed by others. Whatever came next would be challenging and probably painful and certainly uncertain, but it would be mine, chosen and shaped by my decisions rather than roles assigned by others. Morning arrived with the particular quality of light that comes through Brooklyn windows in November, pale and diffuse, lacking the dramatic intensity of summer dawn but carrying its own quiet clarity. I woke disoriented for several seconds before remembering where I was and why I was there. The unfamiliar guest room resolving into focus as the previous night's events reconstructed themselves in my consciousness. The Peninsula Hotel Gala. Robert Chen's public humiliation. My decision to walk out rather than perform the expected role of submissive spouse. The hours spent conducting comprehensive assessment of my situation and resources. The late-night arrival at Elena's apartment with a suitcase suggesting at least temporary separation from my marriage. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Richard and 6 voicemail messages, accumulating through the night while I had been sleeping. There were also text messages, beginning with brief inquiries about where I had gone from the gala and escalating through confusion and annoyance into what appeared to be genuine concern about my safety and whereabouts. The progression of messages revealed Richard's emotional trajectory as the night proceeded, and I failed to respond to any of his attempts at contact. The early messages had carried irritation that I had left the gala without informing him, and created awkwardness when colleagues asked where I had gone. The middle messages showed bewilderment when he arrived home to find my note and realized I was not simply in a different part of the penthouse avoiding conversation. The The final messages suggested actual worry that something might have happened to me, asking me to at least confirm that I was safe even if I was not ready to discuss what had occurred. I responded with a single text message designed to provide minimal necessary information, without inviting extended conversation. I confirmed that I was safe and staying with a friend, that I needed time to process what had happened at the gala, and that I would contact him when I was ready to discuss next steps. The message was deliberately neutral in tone, neither accusatory nor conciliatory, simply establishing that I was exercising agency over my own decisions about communication and timing. Richard's response arrived within seconds, suggesting he had been waiting actively for my reply. He asked where I was staying when I planned to return home, and whether we could meet to discuss what he called a misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. The characterization of Robert Chen's public humiliation as a misunderstanding was revealing in multiple ways. It suggested that Richard either genuinely did not comprehend why I had found the incident unacceptable, or was deliberately minimizing its significance to avoid taking responsibility for his complicity through silence. Either interpretation indicated fundamental problems in how he understood our marriage and my legitimate expectations for basic respect and support. I did not respond to his follow-up message, putting my phone aside to avoid the temptation of engaging in text message conversation that would inevitably be frustrating and unproductive. Elena was in her kitchen making coffee when I emerged from the guest room, still wearing the comfortable clothes I had changed into the previous night after leaving the gala. She greeted me with a gesture toward the coffee pot, and an expression that invited conversation without demanding it, giving me space to determine how much I wanted to discuss versus how much I preferred to keep private while processing. Her apartment smelled like coffee and toast, ordinary domestic scents that felt comforting in their normalcy after months of living in a penthouse where household staff managed all cooking and cleaning, and I rarely engaged in basic domestic activities. I poured coffee and settled at her small kitchen table, a piece of furniture that bore the marks of actual use, rather than existing as a design element in a professionally decorated space. Elena sat across from me with her own coffee, waiting patiently for me to begin the conversation when and how I was ready. Her entire demeanor communicated that she was available to help in whatever way I needed, but was not going to pressure me to share more than I was comfortable revealing. That patience and respect for my autonomy was itself meaningful after years of being married to someone who treated my thoughts and feelings as obstacles to be managed, rather than legitimate perspectives to be considered. I found myself explaining the previous evening in detail that surprised me, describing not just the gala incident but the years of accumulated context that had made Robert Chen's public humiliation the culmination of patterns rather than an isolated event. I talked about the constant dismissal of my legal career as a hobby rather than serious professional work. I described Patricia Whitmore's coaching about the expectations that would come with Richard's partnership, and the implicit requirement that I subordinate my own career to his advancement. I explained Richard's affair with the associate at his firm and my strategic decision not to confront him about it while I was still establishing professional independence. I detailed the comprehensive assessment I had conducted the previous night, cataloging my resources and options and leverage points. Elena listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions but primarily allowing me to construct my own narrative about what had brought me to her apartment at 2 a.m. with a suitcase and a determination to at least temporarily separate from my marriage. When I finished talking, she took time to consider before responding, her silence suggesting genuine thought rather than simply waiting to speak. Her eventual response demonstrated why she had been such an effective mentor, and why I trusted her judgment about complicated situations. She began by affirming that walking out of the gala had been exactly the right response to Robert Chen's behavior, that remaining would have required accepting something fundamentally unacceptable, and that the decision demonstrated both self-respect and strategic intelligence. She noted that public humiliation of the kind Robert had performed was designed to establish dominance and enforce hierarchy, making the target complicit in their own diminishment by forcing them to either accept the treatment or create a scene that could then be characterized as overreaction or emotional instability. By leaving calmly without performing the expected submission or creating dramatic confrontation, I had refused to play the role Robert had assigned while also denying him the satisfaction of either outcome he had anticipated. Elena then moved to more practical considerations about what immediate actions were necessary and what decisions could be deferred, until I had more clarity about my goals and resources. She suggested that I needed to retain a divorce attorney as soon as possible, someone with experience in high-net-worth divorces who would not be intimidated by the Whitmore family resources or legal connections. She knew several attorneys who fit that description and offered to make introductions if I wanted her assistance in finding representation. She emphasized that having legal counsel in place before engaging in extended discussions with Richard would protect my interests and prevent me from inadvertently agreeing to terms that were not actually in my favor. She also recommended that I inform Richard formally that I was seeking legal advice, and that all substantive discussions about separation should wait until I had retained counsel. This would establish appropriate boundaries and signal that I was approaching the situation strategically rather than emotionally, that I understood my rights and was prepared to protect them, and that he should not expect me to simply accept whatever arrangement he or his family proposed. The communication needed to be clear and firm without being aggressive or hostile, maintaining the possibility of cooperative dissolution, while making clear that cooperation required mutual respect and fair dealing. Regarding my professional situation, Elena offered immediate practical support. She explained that the clinic could increase my salary modestly, but could not match corporate firm compensation given their nonprofit budget constraints. However, she knew of several positions at larger legal services organizations that would pay significantly better than my current salary, while still focusing on public interest work. She also mentioned that two small firms she knew were looking for attorneys with civil rights experience and might be interested in discussing opportunities. She promised to make introductions and facilitate conversations with potential employers, while being clear that any decisions about changing positions should wait until my personal situation was more resolved. Most importantly, Elena told me I could stay in her guest room for as long as I needed while organizing more permanent housing. She understood that finding an affordable apartment in New York while going through divorce proceedings was challenging, and she did not want housing pressure to force me into making premature decisions about separation terms or returning to a living situation that was untenable. Her generosity was not about the monetary value of free housing, but about providing the stability and space I needed to make strategic, rather than reactive decisions about my future. We spent the rest of the morning drafting a message to Richard that established appropriate boundaries, while remaining professional and non-hostile. The message acknowledged that we needed to have serious conversations about our marriage and its future, but stated that those conversations should wait until I had retained legal counsel and had time to consider what outcomes I wanted to pursue. The message confirmed that I was safe and staying with a friend, but declined to provide specific location information, explaining that I needed privacy while processing what had occurred at the gala and considering next steps. The message ended by suggesting that we both consult attorneys and then schedule a meeting to discuss separation terms in a structured setting rather than through heated emotional exchanges. Richard's response arrived within an hour of my sending the message, and the tone suggested that he had consulted with someone, probably his father or Robert Chan or the firm's managing partner, about how to handle the situation. The message was more formal than his previous communications, acknowledging that the gala incident had been unfortunate, and that he understood I was upset about how events had unfolded. The word unfortunate was doing significant work in that sentence, characterizing my public humiliation as bad luck rather than deliberate action by his mentor with his silent complicity. The message proposed that we meet for dinner that evening at a restaurant near the penthouse to discuss matters in a calm and rational manner. The proposed dinner meeting was classic Richard, suggesting that complicated emotional and strategic issues could be resolved through a single conversation, in a setting where public context would discourage any emotional expression or genuine conflict. I declined the invitation with a brief response explaining that I was not ready to meet in person, and that substantive discussions should wait until we both had legal representation. His follow-up message expressed frustration with what he characterized as my refusal to communicate like adults, but I did not engage further, recognizing that the exchange was becoming unproductive, and that nothing useful would come from continued text message debate about appropriate process for discussing separation. Elena had scheduled an afternoon meeting with Catherine Hayes, a divorce attorney she knew from collaborative work on cases involving domestic violence survivors. Catherine practiced at a small firm that specialized in family law and had significant experience representing lower-income spouses in divorces from wealthy partners. Her expertise was not in generating massive settlements through aggressive litigation, but in protecting her clients' rights and achieving fair outcomes despite significant resource disparities. Elena had explained that Catherine would be honest about what was and was not achievable given the prenuptial agreement I had signed, and would help me develop realistic strategy rather than encouraging false expectations about potential outcomes. Catherine's office was in a pre-war building near Brooklyn Borough Hall, the kind of unpretentious professional space that signaled competence without expensive overhead. She greeted me with a handshake and direct eye contact that communicated both professional assessment and personal warmth, the balance suggesting someone who took her work seriously, but understood that family law required attending to emotional dimensions alongside legal technicalities. Her office was organized but not obsessively neat, papers and case files arranged in a system that was clearly functional even if it would not photograph well for a design magazine. The space felt appropriate for someone whose priority was effective advocacy, rather than impressive presentation. I had brought a copy of my prenuptial agreement and the notes from my previous night's comprehensive assessment, documentation that would allow Catherine to quickly understand my situation without requiring me to explain everything from the beginning. She reviewed the prenup carefully, occasionally making notes or marking specific provisions that she found significant. Her expression while reading was professionally neutral, revealing neither approval nor disapproval of the agreement's terms, simply processing the information with the analytical attention that complex legal documents required. When she finished reviewing the document, she set it aside and asked me to explain in my own words what had brought me to her office and what outcomes I was hoping to achieve through divorce. I explained the Gala incident and the years of context leading to that breaking point, describing the patterns of dismissal and subordination that had characterized my marriage and my eventual recognition that accepting such treatment was unsustainable regardless of the financial security the marriage provided. I described my legal career and professional relationships, my knowledge of Richard's affair and other potentially relevant information, and my desire to extract myself from the marriage with sufficient resources to establish independent stability, while avoiding unnecessary conflict or public drama that would distract from the fundamental goal of ending a relationship that could not continue on acceptable terms. Catherine listened with the same patient attention Elena had shown that morning, occasionally asking clarifying questions but primarily allowing me to construct the narrative in my own way and according to my own priorities. When I finished, she took time to organize her thoughts before providing her assessment, demonstrating the same respect for complexity and nuance that I tried to bring to my own client consultations at the legal clinic. Her response was detailed and honest in ways that I appreciated, even when the information was not what I had hoped to hear. She began by explaining that the prenuptial agreement was valid and enforceable, drafted competently with clear provisions that would almost certainly survive any challenge I might bring. The agreement specified minimal spousal support for a limited duration, essentially enough to cover basic living expenses for 2 years, while I established independent income. The support amount was calculated based on my income at the time of marriage rather than the lifestyle I had become accustomed to during the marriage, meaning it would provide enough to rent a modest apartment and cover basic needs, but would not maintain anything approaching the standard of living I had experienced as Richard's wife. The agreement also clearly foreclosed any claim to his partnership equity in Whitmore and Associates, or to Whitmore family wealth held in trusts or other protected structures. Catherine explained that challenging the prenup would require proving that it was unconscionable at the time of signing, or that I had signed under duress or without adequate representation, or that Richard had failed to make full financial disclosure before I signed. None of those circumstances appeared to apply based on what I had told her. I had been represented by independent counsel who had reviewed the agreement and advised me about its implications. Richard's financial disclosure had been comprehensive, perhaps even more detailed than legally required. I had signed voluntarily without any pressure or coercion beyond the normal dynamics of someone from a working-class background, marrying into significant wealth, and feeling grateful for the opportunity. The prenup would govern the financial aspects of divorce regardless of what I thought about its fairness 8 years later. However, Catherine continued, the prenup's enforceability did not mean I lacked any leverage or that Richard could simply dictate all terms of separation. There were multiple aspects of divorce beyond financial support that could be negotiated, and that Richard might be motivated to resolve cooperatively, rather than through extended conflict. She asked whether I had evidence of his affair with the firm associate, and I confirmed that I had text messages and credit card statements and other documentation that would clearly establish the relationship. She noted that while New York was a no-fault divorce state where adultery did not affect support calculations, evidence of an affair with a subordinate at his own law firm could create professional complications for Richard, particularly given that Whitmore and Associates presumably had policies against relationships between partners and associates. Catherine explained that Richard's affair could become leverage not for increasing financial support beyond what the prenup specified, but for ensuring that he was cooperative in other aspects of divorce rather than making the process difficult out of spite or control. If he agreed to straightforward dissolution on terms that were fair within the constraints of the prenup, then his affair remained private information that I had no interest in revealing. But if he chose to contest the divorce or make unreasonable demands or create unnecessary complications, then his affair became information that could motivate more reasonable behavior. The leverage was not about blackmail or threats, but about establishing mutual incentives for cooperative resolution, rather than antagonistic litigation. She also noted that my knowledge of firm practices and client relationships could create similar incentives for cooperation, though she cautioned that I needed to be very careful about what information I revealed, and in what context. Using knowledge obtained during the marriage to damage Richard professionally or expose firm misconduct raised ethical questions, and could potentially be characterized as retaliation or breach of confidential communications. However, simply making clear that I understood firm operations and had observed practices that might concern clients or regulators was different from threatening to reveal specific information. The distinction was subtle but legally significant. Catherine's overall assessment was that I should expect to receive the support specified in the prenup, approximately $48,000 annually for 2 years, plus whatever equitable distribution of marital property applied to items we had accumulated during the marriage that were not covered by the prenup's separate property provisions. The equitable distribution would probably include household furnishings, wedding gifts, and potentially my car if it was titled jointly rather than in Richard's name alone. The total value of equitable distribution was likely to be modest, perhaps $20,000 to $30,000 if we went through formal valuation and division processes. These amounts were sufficient to establish initial independent stability, but would require me to build sustainable income through employment rather than relying on divorce proceeds for long-term financial security. She recommended that we send a formal letter to Richard's attorney, once he retained one, proposing cooperative divorce on terms that adhered to the prenup, but that also included his cooperation with reasonable requests about timing and logistics of separation. The letter should avoid any threatening language but should make clear that I was represented by counsel, understood my rights, and was prepared to proceed through formal legal processes if cooperation was not forthcoming. She also recommended that I begin organizing my financial records and identifying which property was mine individually versus marital property subject to division, creating a comprehensive inventory that would support eventual settlement negotiations. Most importantly, Catherine emphasized that my priority should be establishing sustainable employment at a higher salary than my current clinic position, because financial independence was the foundation for everything else I wanted to achieve through divorce. The prenup support was temporary and modest, designed to provide a transition period, rather than long-term maintenance. My legal career and professional relationships were my most valuable assets, worth more than any settlement proceeds I might obtain through divorce. She suggested that I should be actively exploring employment opportunities even while divorce was pending, positioning myself to have stable income established before the support period ended. The meeting with Catherine lasted nearly 3 hours, covering details and scenarios and strategic considerations in sufficient depth that I left her office with clear understanding of realistic outcomes and practical next steps. The news was not entirely what I had hoped, because hope always involves some degree of magical thinking where problems resolve more easily than reality typically allows. But Catherine's assessment was honest and strategic, providing framework for making informed decisions, rather than encouraging unrealistic expectations that would lead to eventual disappointment. I had retained her on the spot, signing an engagement letter and paying an initial retainer from my limited savings, recognizing that legal representation was essential regardless of the cost. Elena had prepared dinner by the time I returned to her apartment, a simple meal that we ate while I processed the afternoon's consultation with Catherine and considered what specific actions I needed to take immediately versus what could wait until circumstances were clearer. The combination of Elena's support and Catherine's legal counsel had transformed my situation from a crisis without structure into a challenge with defined parameters and available resources. I was not powerless despite the significant resource disparity between Richard and myself. I had professional skills and relationships and knowledge and leverage that created possibilities for achieving reasonable outcomes, even within constraints imposed by the prenuptial agreement. Richard had called twice more during the afternoon while I was meeting with Catherine, leaving voicemail messages that oscillated between conciliation and frustration. The first message had adopted a tone of wounded confusion, asking why I was refusing to communicate with him and characterizing my behavior as unreasonable given that he was willing to discuss whatever concerns I had about the Gala incident. The second message had shifted to irritation, noting that my absence from the penthouse was creating awkward questions from his family and colleagues, and that I needed to either return home or provide some explanation he could offer to people who were asking about my whereabouts. Neither message addressed the actual substance of why I had left the Gala or acknowledged that Robert Chen's public humiliation might have been genuinely unacceptable, rather than a minor social awkwardness I was overreacting to. I had not responded to either voicemail, following Catherine's advice that substantive communication should wait until Richard retained his own counsel, and we could engage in structured dialogue, rather than reactive emotional exchanges. My silence was deliberate strategy rather than passive avoidance, creating space for both of us to consult with attorneys and develop clear positions before attempting negotiation. Richard was accustomed to situations where his will prevailed through persistence or pressure, but this situation required actual negotiation between parties with legitimate conflicting interests, a dynamic he had little experience navigating in his personal life, even if it was familiar from his legal practice. That evening I drafted a formal email to Richard proposing that we both retain divorce attorneys and schedule a structured conversation about separation terms once we both had legal counsel. The email was professional in tone, acknowledging that we had significant matters to resolve, but that resolution would be more productive with appropriate legal guidance than through unstructured emotional discussions. I sent the email knowing it would likely frustrate him, but also believing it was the right approach for protecting my interests while maintaining the possibility of cooperative, rather than hostile divorce proceedings. His response arrived the following morning, confirming that he had retained counsel and providing the contact information for his attorney. The attorney was a partner at a different large Manhattan firm that specialized in matrimonial law for high-net-worth clients, someone with a reputation for aggressive advocacy and comprehensive knowledge of strategies for minimizing support obligations and protecting assets in divorce proceedings. The choice of attorney signaled that Richard was approaching divorce strategically rather than cooperatively, retaining someone who would fight for his interests rather than facilitate amicable resolution. That information was useful for calibrating my own expectations and approach, helping me understand that this would likely be adversarial negotiation rather than collaborative problem-solving. Catherine responded to my forwarding of Richard's attorney information with a brief note explaining that she knew the attorney by reputation, describing him as competent and aggressive but also capable of reasonable negotiation when his client's interests were better served by settlement than by litigation. She would reach out to him to schedule a meeting where all four of us could discuss terms and explore whether mutually acceptable resolution was achievable. The meeting would probably happen within the next week or two, depending on attorney scheduling and Richard's willingness to engage promptly rather than delaying in hopes that I would become impatient and accept less favorable terms. The 72 hours since I had walked out of the Peninsula Hotel Gala had fundamentally altered my circumstances and trajectory. I had moved from performing the role of submissive spouse in an untenable marriage to actively pursuing divorce with legal representation and clear strategic framework. I had established temporary housing with a friend who supported my decisions rather than pressuring me to reconcile with Richard for the sake of financial security. I had consulted with experienced divorce counsel, who had provided honest assessment of realistic outcomes and practical guidance about next steps. I had communicated boundaries to Richard and resisted his attempts to resolve matters through informal pressure rather than proper legal process. Most importantly, I had demonstrated to myself that I was capable of making difficult decisions and taking strategic action, even when outcomes were uncertain and consequences were significant. Walking out of that ballroom had required courage, but the actions I had taken in the days following required different capabilities around planning and strategic thinking and sustained determination despite ambiguity about eventual outcomes. Those capabilities had been developing throughout my years at the legal clinic, watching Elena and other attorneys navigate complicated cases where success required combining legal knowledge with strategic judgment and persistent advocacy. Now I was applying those same skills to my own situation, becoming my own most important client in a case where the stakes were my entire future life. The week following my initial consultation with Catherine Hayes unfolded with the particular intensity that comes from living in a state of deliberate transition, where the structures that previously organized daily life have been dismantled but new patterns have not yet solidified into routine. I remained at Elena's apartment in Fort Greene, occupying the guest room that was slowly transforming from temporary refuge into something approaching actual residence. Each morning I woke to the unfamiliar sounds of Brooklyn street life, rather than the engineered silence of the Tribeca penthouse, a reminder that I had chosen displacement and uncertainty over comfortable subordination. My days acquired a new rhythm built around the practical necessities of separation and the ongoing demands of my work at the legal clinic. Mornings began with coffee at Elena's kitchen table, while we reviewed the tasks and decisions that required attention, creating informal accountability that helped me maintain forward momentum during a period when retreating into paralysis would have been emotionally easier. The conversations ranged from strategic planning about divorce proceedings to mundane logistics about where to buy groceries and how to navigate the subway routes between Fort Greene and the clinic's office in downtown Brooklyn. Elena had a gift for treating both categories of concern with equal seriousness, recognizing that successfully managing life transitions required attending to practical details alongside strategic decisions. My work at the clinic provided essential stability during this period of personal upheaval, offering hours each day when I could focus on client problems rather than dwelling on my own uncertain circumstances. The cases I was handling involved the familiar complexity of civil rights violations and housing discrimination, legal problems that were challenging and meaningful and entirely separate from divorce proceedings and marital dissolution. There was something restorative about applying my legal training to help clients navigate systems designed to disadvantage them, using technical knowledge and strategic advocacy to achieve outcomes that materially improved people's lives. The work reminded me that I possess capabilities and expertise independent of my identity as Richard's wife, professional competence that existed whether or not my marriage continued. Catherine had scheduled a four-party meeting for the following Thursday, bringing together both attorneys and both spouses to explore whether cooperative divorce was achievable, or whether we would need to proceed through formal adversarial processes. She had explained that these initial meetings served multiple functions beyond simply exchanging settlement proposals. They allowed attorneys to assess each other's approach and determine whether negotiation was likely to be productive, or would simply waste time before inevitable litigation. They provided opportunity for the spouses to communicate about priorities and concerns in a structured setting with professional guidance. They established tone and expectations for all subsequent interactions, creating either foundation for collaborative problem-solving or confirmation that positions were too divergent for anything except formal legal combat. In preparation for Thursday's meeting, Catherine had asked me to develop a comprehensive statement of what I wanted to achieve through divorce beyond the financial terms specified in the prenuptial agreement. She explained that successful negotiation required understanding, not just legal entitlements but underlying interests and priorities that might be satisfied through various means. If I could clearly articulate what outcomes mattered most to me, she could develop proposals that addressed those interests while working within the constraints imposed by the prenup. Conversely, if I could identify what outcomes I was willing to be flexible about, we could use that flexibility strategically to obtain cooperation on matters that were more important. I had spent Tuesday evening working through Catherine's questions, creating another comprehensive assessment similar to what I had developed the night I left the gala but focused specifically on desired divorce outcomes rather than general situation analysis. The exercise required distinguishing between what I genuinely needed versus what I wanted, between outcomes that were essential for my well-being and stability versus outcomes that would be satisfying but were not actually necessary. The distinction was important because negotiation inevitably involved compromise, and knowing in advance which matters were negotiable versus which required firm advocacy would prevent me from making concessions that I would later regret. The essential non-negotiable outcomes were relatively straightforward. I needed the financial support specified in the prenuptial agreement paid reliably and on schedule, providing the temporary bridge income that would allow me to establish sustainable employment without immediate financial crisis. I needed Richard to cooperate with reasonable timeline for formal separation and divorce, avoiding unnecessary delays that would prolong uncertainty and prevent me from fully moving forward with independent life. I needed him to respect my privacy and not engage in harassment or attempts to pressure me into reconciliation through his family or social connections. I needed clear division of personal property that allowed me to take items that belonged to me individually or had sentimental value, unrelated to their monetary worth. The negotiable outcomes were matters where I had preferences, but could accept various arrangements depending on what Richard was willing to agree to and what trades might facilitate overall settlement. I preferred to receive my share of equitable distribution of marital property as a lump sum rather than through extended division of specific items, simplifying the separation and avoiding continued contact about household belongings. I was willing to be flexible about timing of when I needed to fully vacate the penthouse, giving Richard space to manage his family's questions about our separation without forcing immediate public acknowledgement. I could accept various structures for how the prenup support payments were made, whether monthly or quarterly or in larger chunks, as long as the total amount and duration matched what the agreement specified. Catherine had also asked me to consider what information I possessed that might motivate Richard to be cooperative, rather than making divorce proceedings difficult. This was the most ethically complicated aspect of preparation, because it required deciding what knowledge I was willing to use strategically, and what I preferred to keep private regardless of potential leverage value. The affair with the associate at his firm was the most obvious information that could create problems for Richard if revealed inappropriately. However, using the affair as explicit threat or blackmail would be both ethically questionable and potentially legally problematic, possibly constituting extortion depending on how such threats were framed and communicated. Catherine had explained the distinction between threatening to reveal information if Richard did not meet specific demands, which was clearly inappropriate and possibly criminal, versus simply making clear that I possessed information that could create complications for him, and that his cooperation in divorce proceedings would ensure such information remained private. The former was blackmail. The latter was establishing mutual incentives for settlement. The difference was subtle but legally and ethically significant, turning on whether I was demanding something beyond what I had legal right to receive versus simply encouraging him to provide what I was already entitled to without creating unnecessary conflict. I had spent considerable time thinking about whether I was comfortable using knowledge of Richard's affair even in the more defensible form that Catherine described. Part of me felt that the affair was private marital matter between Richard and myself, something that should be resolved through divorce rather than weaponized for strategic advantage. But another part of me recognized that Richard had already demonstrated willingness to allow me to be publicly humiliated by his mentor without objection, prioritizing his partnership prospects over my dignity. His willingness to subordinate my well-being to his professional interests meant I had no obligation to protect his interests at cost to my own practical needs for cooperative divorce proceedings. The resolution I reached was that I would not proactively threaten to reveal the affair, but would make clear through Catherine that I possessed information about Richard's conduct that could create professional complications for him, if it became necessary to make such information known during contentious divorce proceedings. The framing was deliberately vague, allowing Richard and his attorney to infer what information I possessed without me specifying details or making explicit threats. If Richard chose to cooperate with straightforward divorce on reasonable terms, the information would remain private and irrelevant. If he chose to make proceedings difficult by contesting support or delaying resolution or harassing me during separation, then information about his affair might become relevant to various aspects of the case in ways that would create problems for him professionally and personally. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected complication that temporarily displaced my focus on divorce preparation. I received a phone call at the legal clinic from someone identifying herself as Jennifer Martinez, an associate at Whitmore and Associates who had gotten my contact information from a mutual connection in the legal services community. Jennifer explained that she was calling about a sensitive matter related to the firm and asked whether we could meet in person to discuss it confidentially. The request was unusual enough that my initial reaction was suspicion that this might be some attempt by Richard or the firm to gather information about my intentions or preparation for divorce proceedings. However, Jennifer had anticipated my concern and explained that her call had nothing to do with my marriage to Richard and everything to do with her own situation at Whitmore and Associates. She had been working at the firm for 3 years as a corporate associate and had experienced treatment that she believed constituted workplace discrimination and harassment. She had been documenting incidents for months, but had been afraid to report them internally because she knew how the firm handled complaints that might create problems for profitable partners. Our mutual connection had suggested that I might be willing to provide informal guidance about her options for addressing the situation, given my background in civil rights work and my understanding of how the firm operated. I had agreed to meet Jennifer at a coffee shop in Lower Manhattan that evening, curious about what she wanted to discuss and also recognizing that her situation might provide useful information about firm culture and practices that could be relevant to my own divorce proceedings. When we met, Jennifer was visibly nervous, a young attorney who was clearly conflicted about whether speaking to me was wise or reckless. She explained that she had been assigned to work extensively with Robert Chun on several major client matters, initially viewing the assignment as valuable opportunity to learn from a senior partner and build her reputation within the firm. The experience had been positive for approximately 6 months before Robert's behavior began changing in ways that were increasingly uncomfortable. He started making comments about her appearance that went beyond professional assessment of appropriate courtroom attire, remarking on her body and suggesting that she should emphasize her attractiveness when meeting with certain clients who he claimed would respond well to young female attorneys. He began finding reasons to require late-night work sessions in his office when other attorneys had left for the day, creating situations where they were alone together, and he could make increasingly personal comments that had nothing to do with the legal work they were supposedly discussing. Jennifer had attempted to manage the situation by avoiding one-on-one meetings with Robert when possible, but her strategy had backfired when Robert began criticizing her work performance and excluding her from significant matters, effectively punishing her for not being sufficiently available for the private interactions he was engineering. She had considered reporting his behavior to the firm's Human Resources Department or the Managing Committee, but she knew from other associates that complaints about powerful partners typically resulted in the complaining associate being pushed out of the firm, while the partner faced no meaningful consequences. She had begun looking for other employment, but was finding it difficult to conduct a job search while managing the demanding hours that corporate practice required. What had prompted Jennifer's decision to reach out to me specifically was learning about the Gala incident from other firm associates who had been in attendance. Word had spread quickly through the firm about Robert Chun publicly calling me out during his remarks and my decision to walk out rather than perform the expected submission. Jennifer had heard various versions of what had occurred, some characterizing my departure as emotional overreaction, and others suggesting it was deliberate refusal to accept humiliation. Regardless of interpretation, my action had apparently created significant conversation within the firm about Robert's leadership, and whether his behavior toward spouses and associates reflected the professional culture that Whitmore and Associates claimed to maintain. Jennifer explained that several other associates, both women and men, had been discussing whether Robert's treatment of me at the gala was indicative of broader cultural problems at the firm that extended beyond any single incident. These conversations had revealed that multiple associates had experienced or witnessed problematic behavior from various partners, creating patterns that suggested systematic issues rather than isolated incidents. Jennifer had decided to document what she knew and had experienced, creating a comprehensive record that could support potential claims if she decided to pursue formal complaints or legal action. She was sharing this information with me both to seek advice about her own situation and to provide me with knowledge about firm dynamics that might be relevant to whatever I was planning regarding my marriage and relationship with the firm. The information Jennifer provided was both disturbing and strategically valuable. Disturbing because it confirmed that Robert Chen's willingness to publicly humiliate me at the gala was consistent with how he treated other people he viewed as subordinate or available for exploitation. Strategically valuable because it suggested that I was not the only person at Whitmore and Associates who had legitimate grievances about how the firm operated, and who might be willing to take action if sufficient support and protection could be assembled. Jennifer was documenting her experiences, but she was doing so in isolation, and without clear plan for how to use the documentation to protect herself or achieve accountability for the problematic behavior she had experienced. I had provided Jennifer with information about her legal options under employment discrimination and sexual harassment laws, explaining the relevant statutes and procedures for filing complaints with government agencies or bringing civil suits against employers. I also connected her with several employment discrimination attorneys I knew through the clinic's referral network, people who could provide more detailed advice about the strength of potential claims and strategic considerations for pursuing them. Most importantly, I asked Jennifer whether she knew other associates who had similar experiences or concerns about firm culture, suggesting that collective action by multiple people would be more effective and less risky than individual complaints that could be dismissed or punished. Jennifer had confirmed that she knew at least 15 associates who were unhappy with their treatment at the firm and who had been discussing whether there were any realistic options for demanding changes, or whether their only choice was to leave quietly and hope for better experiences at other firms. The associates were at various levels of seniority and worked in different practice groups, but they shared common concerns about excessive work demands, discriminatory treatment based on gender and race, retaliation against anyone who raised questions about partner behavior, and a pervasive culture that valued billable hours and client retention above all other considerations, including attorney well-being and ethical practices. I had asked Jennifer whether these associates might be willing to meet as a group to discuss their concerns and explore what collective action might be possible. She had been hesitant, explaining that most of them were afraid of retaliation and doubtful that anything would change even if they tried to push back against firm leadership. However, she agreed to reach out to a core group of associates she trusted and gauge their interest in having a conversation about possibilities for demanding accountability and cultural change. We agreed to stay in communication and to meet again once she had a better sense of whether sufficient people were willing to take action to make collective advocacy viable. Walking back to Elena's apartment after my meeting with Jennifer, I found myself processing how this new information intersected with my own divorce proceedings and strategic positioning. Jennifer had inadvertently provided me with knowledge about firm vulnerabilities that went far beyond Richard's individual affair, or my personal grievances about how I had been treated. If 15 or more associates were genuinely unhappy and potentially willing to take action, their collective departure or public complaints could create serious problems for Whitmore and Associates, disrupting operations and damaging the firm's reputation in ways that would affect client retention and recruiting and partner profitability. This knowledge created possibilities I had not previously considered. Rather than simply pursuing divorce from Richard and moving forward with independent life, I could potentially facilitate or support collective action by firm associates that would achieve accountability for the problematic culture that had produced my own experience of subordination and humiliation. The Gala incident with Robert Chun was not isolated misbehavior, but symptom of systematic cultural problems that affected many people beyond myself. Addressing those problems would require coordinated action by people with direct stakes in firm operations, rather than external complaints that could be dismissed as coming from disgruntled former spouses. However, facilitating such action also carried risks and raised ethical questions that required careful consideration. I had knowledge of firm operations from being married to Richard, information that had been shared in confidential marital communications, and that might be protected from use in adversarial contexts. Using that information to support associate complaints or organize collective action could potentially be characterized as breach of confidential communications or misuse of privileged information. Catherine would need to advise me about what information I could appropriately share and in what contexts, distinguishing between knowledge I had from my own observations versus information Richard had shared with me in confidence during our marriage. Thursday morning arrived with the particular nervous energy that precedes important meetings where outcomes are uncertain and stakes are significant. The four-party divorce meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Catherine's office, neutral territory that avoided the power dynamics of meeting at Richard's attorney's much larger and more impressive firm. I dressed carefully in professional attire that suggested competence and seriousness without appearing to be trying too hard to impress anyone. The goal was to present myself as a serious person with legitimate interests who was prepared to engage in good faith negotiation, but who would not be intimidated or pressured into accepting unreasonable terms. Catherine and I met 30 minutes before Richard and his attorney were scheduled to arrive, using the time to review strategy and prepare for various scenarios that might unfold during the meeting. She explained that initial four-party sessions typically followed predictable patterns. Richard's attorney would present their position on settlement terms, probably proposing something less favorable than what the prenup specified while framing it as generous given my limited legal entitlements. We would respond with our position, adhering to prenup terms but requesting cooperation on logistics and timeline. The subsequent discussion would reveal whether both sides were genuinely interested in settlement, or whether Richard was planning to make divorce proceedings difficult out of spite or strategic calculation that delay would pressure me into accepting less favorable terms. Catherine had also coached me on how to conduct myself during the meeting. I should remain calm and professional regardless of what Richard or his attorney said, avoiding emotional reactions that could be used to characterize me as unstable or unreasonable. I should speak clearly and directly when asked questions, but should defer to Catherine for legal arguments or strategic responses. I should take notes about what was proposed but should not commit to any specific terms without having time to review them carefully with Catherine outside the pressure of face-to-face negotiation. Most importantly, I should remember that this meeting was simply an initial conversation rather than final resolution, creating space for considered decision-making rather than reactive agreements that I might later regret. Richard arrived precisely at 10 o'clock accompanied by his attorney, Douglas Pemberton, a partner at one of Manhattan's most prominent matrimonial law firms. Douglas was in his mid-50s, professionally polished in ways that signaled expensive tailoring and regular attention from personal groomers who maintained the appearance of effortless sophistication. His demeanor combined professional courtesy with subtle superiority, the bearing of someone accustomed to representing wealthy clients in high-stakes disputes, and prevailing through superior resources and strategic expertise. Richard looked tired, suggesting that the past week had been stressful for him in ways that perhaps paralleled my own experience of disruption and uncertainty. The meeting began with formal introductions and Catherine's explanation of the purpose of bringing everyone together. She emphasized that the goal was to explore whether mutually acceptable settlement terms existed that would allow for cooperative divorce, sparing both parties the expense and emotional toll of adversarial litigation. She acknowledged that prenuptial agreement would govern financial aspects of settlement, but noted that many other matters required resolution, and that cooperation on those matters would benefit everyone involved. Her tone was professional and conciliatory, establishing expectation of good faith negotiation, while also making clear that she was prepared to litigate if necessary to protect my interests. Douglas responded with similar professional courtesy, while also asserting Richard's position on key issues. He explained that Richard was willing to proceed with divorce but was concerned about several aspects of what he characterized as my precipitous departure from the marriage. Richard wanted assurance that I would not make allegations about his conduct or firm operations that could damage his professional reputation or partnership prospects. Richard was willing to provide the financial support specified in the prenuptial agreement, but expected that I would vacate the marital residence promptly and would not make claims to property that clearly belonged to him individually. Richard hoped that we could resolve matters quickly and quietly, allowing both of us to move forward without unnecessary public attention or extended legal proceedings. The response was revealing in multiple ways. Richard's primary concern appeared to be protecting his reputation and partnership prospects, rather than the emotional dimensions of ending our marriage, or any genuine reflection on what had brought us to divorce. His framing of my departure as precipitous suggested he still did not comprehend why walking out of the gala had been necessary rather than overreaction, still viewing the incident through lens of minor social awkwardness rather than fundamental disrespect. His expectation that I would not make allegations about his conduct suggested awareness that such allegations could be made and could create problems for him, implicitly acknowledging that his behavior had been problematic even if he was not willing to admit it explicitly. Catherine responded by clarifying my position on each issue Douglas had raised. I had no interest in making public allegations about Richard's personal conduct, as long as divorce proceedings were handled cooperatively and respectfully. I was entitled to financial support per the prenuptial agreement and expected those payments to be made reliably and on the specified schedule. I was willing to vacate the penthouse within a reasonable time frame but needed sufficient time to secure alternative housing and arrange for moving my personal belongings. I expected equitable distribution of marital property to proceed according to New York law, meaning that items acquired during the marriage would be divided fairly regardless of whose name appeared on purchase records or titles. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, moving through various specific issues and exploring where agreement existed versus where positions diverged. Douglas attempted several times to pressure me into accepting less favorable terms than the prenup specified, suggesting that my legal career prospects would be damaged by extended divorce proceedings, and that I should accept modest settlement to avoid such complications. Catherine responded firmly each time, making clear that we were prepared to litigate if necessary, and that attempts at intimidation were counterproductive to achieving the cooperative resolution that would benefit both parties. The critical moment came when Douglas suggested that Richard was concerned about what I might say to other people at Whitmore and Associates about firm operations or culture. Catherine seized on this concern, asking directly what specific information Richard was worried about, and why he thought I might share it inappropriately. The question forced Douglas and Richard to either specify their concerns or retreat from the vague threat they had been implying. After brief consultation with Richard, Douglas acknowledged that Richard had been involved in a personal relationship with a colleague at the firm, and was concerned that I might reveal this information in ways that could create professional complications. Catherine responded with strategic precision. She confirmed that I was aware of Richard's relationship, and had no intention of revealing it publicly, as long as divorce proceedings were handled appropriately. However, if Richard made divorce difficult through unreasonable positions or harassment, then information about his conduct might become relevant to various aspects of the case, and might need to be disclosed in legal filings or proceedings. The message was clear without being explicitly threatening. Richard's cooperation in straightforward divorce would ensure his affair remained private. Lack of cooperation would remove any obligation I had to protect his privacy about matters that could create professional problems for him. The exchange had shifted the power dynamic in the room. Douglas and Richard had revealed that they were concerned about information I possessed, confirming that such information had value as leverage, even if I never actually used it. Catherine had established that while we preferred cooperative resolution, we were prepared to litigate aggressively if necessary, and Richard had vulnerabilities that would make litigation more costly for him than simple financial expenditure. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with noticeably more respect for my positions, and less attempts to pressure me into accepting unfavorable terms. We concluded the meeting with agreement on several preliminary matters and identification of issues requiring further discussion. Richard agreed to provide financial support per the prenup beginning immediately rather than delaying until divorce was finalized. I agreed to provide specific list of personal property I was claiming and timeline for when I would vacate the penthouse. Both sides agreed to exchange financial disclosures and continue settlement discussions through our attorneys, rather than direct communication between Richard and myself. The meeting had not resolved everything, but it had established framework for continued negotiation, and had demonstrated that I was prepared to protect my interests strategically, rather than simply accepting whatever Richard proposed. Walking out of Catherine's office after the meeting, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or satisfaction exactly, but recognition of capability. I had navigated a difficult meeting with professionalism and strategic focus, supported by competent legal counsel, and prepared with clear understanding of my positions and leverage. Richard and his expensive attorney had not intimidated me or pressured me into accepting less than I was entitled to. The marriage that had required me to perform subordination and accept diminishment was ending, and I was demonstrating in the process that the person Richard had married was more capable and strategic than he had ever recognized or valued. The weekend following the four-party divorce meeting brought a shift in my understanding of what was possible beyond simply extracting myself from an untenable marriage. Jennifer Martinez had contacted me Friday evening to report that she had spoken with 12 associates at Whitmore and Associates about the possibility of meeting to discuss their collective concerns about firm culture and treatment. 8 of them had expressed genuine interest in attending such a meeting, willing to at least explore whether coordinated action might be feasible, even if they remained skeptical about whether anything would actually change. The remaining 4 were too afraid of retaliation to participate even in preliminary conversations, their fear itself revealing something significant about the climate of intimidation that pervaded the firm. Jennifer and I had scheduled the meeting for Sunday afternoon at a community center in Brooklyn, neutral territory that was geographically and psychologically distant from the Manhattan legal world, where Whitmore and Associates operated. The location choice was deliberate, creating space where associates could speak candidly without the surveillance and performance pressures that characterize their daily work environment. Elena had offered to attend the meeting in a supporting capacity, bringing her experience organizing collective action among legal services attorneys, and her understanding of how to build coalition among people who shared grievances, but had not yet developed unified vision of what they wanted to achieve. Sunday morning I spent several hours preparing for the meeting with the same methodical attention I brought to preparing for client consultations at the legal clinic. The goal was not to arrive with predetermined agenda or solutions, but rather to create framework for productive conversation where people could identify shared concerns, articulate collective interests, and begin exploring what actions might be available to them. I drafted discussion questions designed to surface common themes across individual experiences and to help the group think strategically about leverage points and realistic objectives. I compiled information about employment law protections and collective action strategies that might be relevant depending on what concerns the associates identified as most pressing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.